into the third chapter of Exodus this morning. This features this sort of famous story of the burning bush. Theologians call this a theophany. Let me read the definition, and then maybe we'll have a test at the end here. But a theophany is a physical, visible manifestation or appearance of God in space and time that is tangible to the human senses. We're going to dive into this a little bit here this morning, but that's exactly what's happening at the burning bush. In sort of modern language, God is in the house. In an important sense, God, of course, is always in the house. He's omnipresent, meaning that all of God is present everywhere all the time. We can't get our heads around that really, but it's true of him in his omnipresence. At the burning bush, God made himself tangibly present to one person, to Moses, in the then and there. All of God was there, but not all of God was revealed. Moses is one of the more sort of iconic figures in the Bible, right? Everybody knows Moses. Everybody knows about the Nile bulrush's birth. Everyone knows about parting the Red Sea, the Ten Commandments, leading the Israelites in the wilderness. The secular culture knows Moses. If you talk to people and say, do you know Moses, or what's Moses all about, they can generally give you an answer. It's just one of those iconic sort of characters in the Bible. But the burning bush is on that list as well. Most people have heard of that. Most people in our wider culture, but unfortunately I think the cultural understanding of what we're going to speak about this morning is pretty shallow. Until you really take a look at the Bible as a whole, our culture kind of thinks of it as a nice set of stories or myths or good advice kind of a thing. And obviously that's not what we as followers of Jesus think. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, for the word of the cross is folly or foolish or ridiculous or laughable. The word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. So the full richness of what God wants to reveal about himself at the burning bush is truly amazing. I hope you come away this morning thinking that. It's really a stunning display of his holiness and his presence, his unchanging commitment to the promises that he's made to his people then and to us today. A timeless sort of unfolding of his will and his plan at the right time, with the right people, in the right manner. Grace and mercy of the deliverance from sin that he offers to us, just like deliverance from Egypt, that's applicable to us as well. So let's, as usual, kind of review the context a little bit so we know where we are in the frame of things here. So at the end of Genesis, we have Joseph about to pass away. He's led his family, his brothers, back to Egypt. They're prosperous. Joseph is one of the elites of Egypt at the time. The Hebrew people are doing fine. They're happy. They're prosperous. Joseph passes away. A number of years pass, and this system of oppression and slavery starts to take effect. It goes sort of a 180 for the Hebrews in their time here in Egypt. Moses is born. As we saw last week, murders the Egyptian person, flees into exile in the desert. He spends the next 40 years there as a shepherd, interestingly enough. And then we'll see that he's then called back to Egypt. So the burning bush story is the site of his calling or his commissioning. We're going to look at the last couple of verses of chapter 2, just to give us a lead in here. The narrator has turned national in the focus there. He's talking about the Hebrew people as a whole. Then when we get to chapter 3, we'll see that he turns the focus very narrowly and individually to Moses. Now, you'll find this in the Pew Bible in front of you there in the rack on page 46. Follow along with me as I read here. Last 3 verses of Exodus 2. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. What's happening here is God is preparing his people, the Hebrews, for their deliverance. At the same time, he's preparing the deliverer to carry out that deliverance. So it's really a remarkable sort of pattern that's happening there with God as he's orchestrating all of these events that will come together. He's a God who hears. Listen to some of those personal words here. He hears, he remembers, he sees, he knows. These are words of personal relationship. God longs to be in a relationship personally with each of us. It's really a stunning kind of a God that we worship. Then we return again to Moses here, starting in verse 1 of chapter 3. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now that's Horeb and Sinai are the same mountains. Nobody's quite sure where they are. It's somewhere in what is now southern Saudi Arabia. It's clearly wilderness at this time, the desert. But it's this same mountain where Moses receives his commission, and also later we'll see receives the 10 Commandments and meets with God. And it's a very pivotal kind of physical area that's involved here. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great or strange sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. First thing here, note the urgency. Moses, Moses. He uses his name twice. It immediately reminds us of the Apostle Paul, then Saul on the Damascus Road. The voice comes out of heaven, Saul, Saul. There's urgency there. God is seeking and wanting to speak with him. So Moses, remember, had received kind of the best of the best in Egypt. He was one of the elites, the best education. He was wealthy, powerful. His future was secure. Acts 7 describes this when Stephen is preaching. Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds. He was kind of a self-reliant, self-absorbed guy. And yet he was born a Hebrew. And the book of Hebrews in the New Testament tells of this remarkable change of heart or spirit that Moses had. Instead of clinging to this Egyptian elite lifestyle, he clearly makes a commitment to what he calls his people, the Hebrews. It's a real correct change of heart for Moses, and it's critical to understanding what happens here as we move forward. But in Hebrews, it's described this way. Moses refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. So he knows who he is, he accepts who he is. He's a son of Israel. He chose God over Egypt, but then as we saw, he proceeded to sort of take matters into his own hands, and it didn't go well. He ends up committing this crime, fleeing into the desert, and then he'll spend the next 40 years receiving the preparation from God that he should have gotten earlier. His time in Egypt was part of his life, but it was not the preparation God had for him. He becomes a shepherd. He's watching sheep owned by his own father-in-law, so he doesn't even own his sheep. His preparation is just now beginning at age 40. I think, again, in sort of modern language, we might say that God is rebooting Moses. He learns to be a shepherd, and obviously we can play that out a little bit, and he's going to shepherd the Hebrews, the children of Israel, away from Egypt and into the exile. So 40-year-old Moses tried to do it his own way, on his own terms, on his own strength. 40 years later, 80-year-old Moses has somewhat reluctantly but still learned that he's got to do things God's way, on God's terms. So he learns how to be a servant in this wilderness time, this 40 years. And we can sort of zoom back from this, and it's pretty clear that God didn't want 40-year-old Moses. He wanted 80-year-old Moses. They're two different people, and it's an interesting study there to compare the two. And there's application for us as well. I mean, quite often we'll say, I can do this my way, in my strength. I've been prepared by God. I can take care of this. And obviously that's not the way it should be. In fact, Moses himself, a little bit older than 80 now, this will be in a few weeks, but in Exodus 15, he describes this sort of new relationship with God. He says it this way: "The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him." So he had come to accept his own weakness, his own insufficiency, and paradoxically, this is his strength, really. He's acknowledged who he is. Of course, rolling forward into the New Testament, Jesus is the perfect example of this strength and weakness. Philippians 2, Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So by age 80, Moses had learned to be the shepherd leader that God had planned and that God needed and that God wanted to use. Here I am at the burning bush. When he first comes over there, he says, "Here I am." That's a declaration of readiness. He's acknowledged that he's ready to go. You could think of it another way as, "I am at your service." He's prepared, and he understands that. It's similar to what the prophet Isaiah said, "Here I am, send me." Same kind of eagerness here with Moses. As we study this encounter over the next few weeks, though, we'll see that this sort of initial eagerness of "here I am, send me" kind of attitude gives way fairly quickly at the same incident to this kind of plea of "send someone else." Here I am, I'm ready, and then shortly after, send somebody else. So there's still issues there that Moses has to work with. But this is the Moses that God confronts at the burning bush. The text says the angel of the Lord appeared. This is Yahweh. It's you notice in the text of it, the word Lord is capitalized, all capitals. That means Yahweh. That's God himself. So it's a little difficult to follow, but it says an angel of the Lord, but really what's happening here is God was there in that bush. Specifically in the fire, the message appeared in the form of fire that didn't consume the bush, and then the voice of God came out of the midst of the bush. The fire was inside the bush, or it's not on top of it or covering it. It was the text says in the midst of it, so it's an interesting physics kind of question there, but it's clear that it wasn't consumed. A guy called R.C. Sproul wrote a great little devotional book here, Moses and the Burning Bush, and he describes this way. He says the fire was in but not of the bush. And I think that captures it. A supernatural, visible manifestation of the glory of God. This is a great little devotional book. We've ordered a number of copies, and we'll have them available here. I'm not sure I have enough for everybody, but please take one, maybe one per family to make sure everybody gets one, but they'll be at the back and somewhere up here at front after the service. It's our gift to everyone. And read it, of course, but feel free to pass it on to someone. It's a remarkable little devotional book here. So a little diversion here. There's a number of instances in the Bible where we see fire involved. It's you could consider it a theme, really, in the way God reveals himself and his glory and his might. For our purposes, the most relevant example of that comes from Genesis 15. And the reason it's relevant is God is working with Abram. He hasn't quite become Abraham yet, but he's giving him his covenant. He's saying, I'm going to provide you and your people with this land. And that's what you see happening in Exodus. So, in Genesis 15, God is telling Abraham, here's what's going to happen moving forward. And in terms of the involvement of fire here, this covenant is struck between God and Abraham, and then it's described this way. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. Sunday evening, this afternoon at 5, we'll gather back here. The plan will be to dive into that a little bit more. There's some really interesting kind of teachings we can teach ourselves with this whole theme of fire, especially in the Old Testament, but we'll also see some New Testament examples as well. Moving on with verses 5 and 6 here. Then God said, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. This kind of seems a little odd, I think. First, God calls to Moses, Moses, come here. And then he says, not too close, come here, but don't come here. It's a little bit of an odd scenario there. A summons to approach and then a command to stay away. I think what's happening here is that the physical area that was involved with this bush and its surroundings had become holy. God's presence was there. God in his fullness was present in this spot. So the physical ground became holy. Sinful kind of human Moses, and ourselves as well, cannot be in the presence of that sort of holiness. So I think it's come here and experience my presence, but not too close, because this is holy ground. So God is present, making what had been ordinary holy, set apart for God's use. It's very much a conversion experience for Moses we see happening here. And then God further emphasizes this by telling him to take off his shoes. That's still a sign of respect in many cultures today, the removal of your footwear. It also is an acknowledgement by Moses that not only is he on holy ground, but he's a defiled person. He's a sinful person. He's not worthy to be in that presence. He's confessing both his own personal defilement and his own unworthiness. So we're seeing Moses now at a place where God wants him to be. The question for us then is, have we ever felt ourselves in the presence of God in a way that we want to take off our sandals, so to speak, spiritually, and hide our face? It's a bit of a challenge. We invoked God's presence here this morning. I think he's here. In fact, I know he's here. but have we taken off our sandals? Have we hidden our face? It's a heart attitude question that we really have to address whenever, not just here in a church building, but whenever we're seeking God's presence. R.C. Sproul again says it this way about attendance on Sunday mornings. He says, "We step across the threshold from the secular into the realm of the sacred. That which is sacred is different. It has been set apart divinely by God. The sacred space is where God steps and acts and moves." We, of course, prefer to spend our time on unholy ground. It's safer, it's less challenging, more in our control. We were created, however, to gaze upon and be in God's presence. Sin intruded, and we have the issues we all face with our spiritual walks, but someday we'll face Him, and we're not going to survive unless we're holy. So we cannot make our own selves holy. It's not a work we can do for ourselves. We're not Moses at age 40 delivering Egypt himself out of his own strength. The only door to the holiness that we will need is Jesus. Colossians 1. "And you who once were alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, He is now reconciled in His body of flesh by His death, in order to present you holy and blameless." The work of Christ on the cross gives us that holiness so that God will accept us. This is the deliverance of the Hebrews from Egypt is a prototype of this exact salvation experience that Jesus offers all of us. A.W. Tozer captures the challenge here. Excuse me. "Until we have seen ourselves as God sees us, we are not likely to be much disturbed over conditions around us as long as they do not get out of hand or threaten our comfortable way of life. We've learned to live with unholiness and have come to look upon it as the natural and expected thing. God's holiness is not simply the best we know, infinitely bettered. We know nothing like divine holiness. It stands apart, unique, unapproachable, incomprehensible, and unattainable." So then in verse 6, God has presented this to Moses, and then He tells Moses who He is. He's the God of your father, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. This is a phrasing that's repeated throughout the Old Testament. This is how God identifies Himself. Here He refers to Moses' own father, so it becomes personal. He's the God of Moses and his family. And then also the unchanging, promise-keeping God of the entire Hebrew race. He's declaring that He doesn't change. He keeps His promises. He fulfills His will. John chapter 8, Jesus links Himself to this. So God with Moses is saying, "I'm unchanging, promise-keeping, I'll always be with you. I'm the God of the past and the present and the future." And Jesus claims that for Himself as well. "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." I mean, that's the gospel. Do you see that there? Moses was afraid, and he hid his face when he realized he was in the presence of holiness. Same kind of fear that Isaiah exhibited when he found himself in the presence of God. Chapter 6 of Isaiah. "And I said, woe is me, for I am lost. I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips." And here it is, "For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Lord there is Yahweh, again in all capitals. So initially, Moses is curious about this bush on fire but not burning up. Eventually, he realizes that God, in fact, is present there in this phenomenon, and he acts accordingly. He does the right thing. We need to be on our guard that we don't inadvertently defile the holy ground we find ourselves on. We need to discern it and act accordingly when we find ourselves there. We all spend our time hiding our face from God, and that's something we're learning from this morning here. One author put it this way: as we approach the God who has freely and lovingly given himself to us, we do well to draw near with great humility, much like Moses approaching the burning bush. We are created for the knowledge of God, but presently we are bent and wounded, skewed by our disproportionate desire for lesser goods and our twisted craving for a multitude of evils. Comprehending the incomprehensible God is no longer natural to us. Verses 7 and 8 here. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the mosquito bites, and just making sure you're listening. So look at how God relates to his people here, right? Look at some of the language. It's language of personal relationship. He's seen them, he's heard them, he knows their meanings, he's concerned about them in an emotional way. He's coming down. These are actions of a God who longs for personal relationship with us. He can and does, even today, intervene in human affairs in human ways. The incarnation of Jesus, of course, is the highest and best example of that. He made his dwelling among us. So just as God delivered his people out of Egypt through the vessel of Moses, he'll deliver us from the slavery of sin through Jesus. You see the parallel there. That's what we're being taught. And we see it in the Lord's Prayer, deliver us from evil. And the sense of deliverance is very important here, Jesus being the ultimate deliverer. So God is aware of us. He's aware of our problems, our needs, our struggles. He knows us better than we know ourselves, which is a little bit scary sometimes, but a great comfort too. He wants us to know him. He wants to enter into personal relationship with us. He's not ashamed of us. Have you ever thought of that? God is not ashamed of you. I know my own heart, and he should be, but he's not. And it tells us this in Hebrews chapter 11. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. So all of this sets the stage for this job offer that's made to Moses here. Verses 9 and 10. And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Again, this is the actual commissioning of Moses for his work. But you can almost hear Moses saying, wait, what? I already tried that, and it didn't work out so well. But after 80 years of preparation, God reveals his will, and Moses is commissioned. He's to be the vehicle through which God delivers the people from Egypt. They'll be brought out of Egypt and brought to something else. That's a critical thing to remember here. It's not just fixing the Egypt problem. It's delivering them to what God has for them, in this case, the Promised Land. Same exact way that we get delivered from the slavery of sin to eternal life with him. So we'll see in coming weeks that a couple of things here. God's confrontation with evil brings justice and rescue for the Israelites. It'll take some doing with Pharaoh, but they will eventually be removed from Egypt. And Jesus has done the same for us, deliverance and rescue. Secondly, we'll see God's desire and plan to dwell among the Israelites. This will come to its full kind of fruit with the tabernacle. But same thing with Jesus in John, when he comes and dwells with us. He dwelt among us. The word there is tabernacled. He tabernacled with us. Ephesians 3, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. We'll also see that God's faithfulness to his promises and commitment, and despite an often unfaithful people in the wilderness. Same thing with us. These promises are ours as well, and unfortunately our faithlessness is sometimes in control. Romans 5, God shows us his love for us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. We'll also see in the Exodus story that sin and idolatry pose the greatest threat to some of these promises and these blessings. And like a broken record, again, we're not any different. Romans 3, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But the starting point for us here is Moses at the burning bush. An author named Dallas Willard causes us to kind of confront the challenging truth of this as we try to apply it to our own hearts. We must ask ourselves what it would be like if we were Moses standing by the bush. So you kind of picturing in your mind if that was you. We must pray for the faith and the experiences that would enable us to believe that such things could happen to us. Do we believe that? Do we believe that an encounter with the very presence of God is available to us? Only then will we be able to recognize, accept, and dwell in them when they come. So godly preparation for this, experiencing this the presence of God, that's where service starts. So we can't serve him without being in his presence and understanding the importance of it. It's kind of amazing that God uses sinful people like us to accomplish his will. He doesn't need us. He could do whatever he wants without us, and probably faster and quicker and better. But yet he does bother with us. I think the reason for that has to do with his love and his desire for intimacy and relationship with us. He chooses to accomplish his will through the willing obedience of faithful people, faithful servants. Moses received his specific calling to that service at the burning bush. All of us have received a calling as well. That's a conversation for another day, but there's a great deal of important discernment and discipleship work for each of us to understand the calling that God has called us to, the service. It all starts with being in his presence. God also uses us to spread his word, to evangelize. In fact, in this case, our involvement is mandatory. At the Great Commission at the end of Matthew, Jesus said to his disciples, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." So you stop there and you say, okay, well, Jesus is going to take care of this evangelism stuff. He's going to deal with it. But then he goes on and he says to his disciples, he commissions them. All authority is given to me, but then he says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you." So his disciples, and by extension us, are a critical component of spreading his word. And then he guarantees that or empowers that with his presence. He says, "And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." That's a privilege we have to participate in that, in carrying out his will. And he continues to communicate with us actively today, just like he did with Moses. He calls us to serve him. We need to be listening. Do we know how to listen? He speaks to us through his word, through prayer, discipleship with ourselves and others. All of this, informed by the Holy Spirit, is how God communicates with us. At least I haven't ever encountered a burning bush that wasn't being consumed, but all of us have experienced the communication from God in some form. And that's what being in his presence is all about. So Moses comes to the bush and said, here I am. I'm here. I'm ready to go. Let's do this. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to take a look at his response. And kind of spoiler alert here, it's not pretty. He ends up offering 5 objections to God, and we'll study them. And what we'll draw from that is that we do the same exact thing. We object to God on all sides, all the time. What we'll see is that Moses again went from this sort of exuberant, here I am, to this sort of despondent, anxiety-ridden, send somebody else. And that's, it's going to be a challenging, but I think a worthwhile study as we try to bring that into our own hearts and our own lives. There's a remarkable devotional classic called The Practice of the Presence of God. Some of you may have read it. It's by a 17th century monk called Brother Lawrence. He actually spent his time as a monk, his life, working in the kitchen of this monastery, washing dishes. And he wrote this book is actually a compilation after his death of his letters and his sayings and conversations and things, but it's well worth studying. But he describes the presence of God this way. He says, a habitual, silent, and secret conversation of the soul with God. As we close here, the psalmist, Psalm 139, takes that a step further and makes clear that we can't escape his presence. We can try to and spend all our time avoiding it, but he's all around us. His presence is real and it's everywhere. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down. You are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain it. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? So Moses found himself standing in the presence of God. That's available to us as well. God longs for us to be in his presence, and that's our challenge as we move forward.